I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the discharge paper shaking in his hands on Christmas Eve, because no one leaves a hospital smiling when they have nowhere to go. The parking lot was nearly empty, the kind of quiet that settles in after 7 p.m. when families are already home, lights glowing through windows, dinner on the table, and yet there they were, an elderly couple standing under a flickering streetlight, holding onto each other like the cold might pull them apart if they let go. I slowed my car without thinking, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel as I watched them from a distance, telling myself it wasn't my business, that people have arrangements, that maybe someone was coming. But then I saw the way the woman kept glancing toward the entrance doors, not with expectation, but with something closer to confusion. I parked anyway. I told myself I just needed to ask if they were all right. Nothing more. The air hit me sharp when I stepped out, colder than it had any right to be. The kind that seeps through your coat and settles in your bones. Are you waiting for someone? I asked gently, keeping my voice steady, the way you do when you don't want to embarrass someone. The man looked at me first, his smile arriving too quickly, too practiced. Our son's on his way, he said, and the woman nodded beside him, her lips pressed together like she was holding something back. I glanced at their hands, at the paper, at the small suitcase by their feet, and something didn't line up. How long have you been waiting? I asked, and the woman hesitated, just for a second, before saying, not long. But her voice didn't match the way her shoulders sagged, didn't match the way her fingers trembled around the edge of that document. I offered to call their son, just to make sure everything was all right, and that's when the man's expression shifted, just slightly, like a crack in glass you only notice when the light hits it. Phone's dead, he said quickly, almost too quickly. And I nodded as if that made sense, even. Though it didn't. Not really. Not on a night like this. I should have walked away then, I suppose, told myself it wasn't my place, that I'd done enough by asking, but I didn't, because I knew what it looked like when someone was trying to convince themselves of a story that wasn't true. I had done it once, years ago, standing in my own kitchen after my husband passed, telling myself my son was just busy, that the silence didn't mean anything. That distance was temporary. It wasn't. I looked at the couple again, at the way they leaned into each other, not out of affection, but out of necessity, and I made a decision I couldn't take back. It's too cold to wait out here, I said, keeping my tone light, casual, like it wasn't a big deal. Why don't you come sit in my car for a bit? Warm up until your son gets here. And they exchanged a glance, the kind that carries a whole conversation without a single word, before the woman nodded slowly. I reached for their suitcase without asking, lifting it with more ease than I expected, and that's when I noticed the envelope tucked halfway inside, the edge of a document peeking out, stamped and official, the kind of paper you don't misplace by accident. I didn't read it then, not yet, but I felt something settle in my chest, something cold and certain. Whatever story they were holding on to, it wasn't the truth, and I had a feeling I was about to find out just how far that lie went. I turned the heater up the moment they settled into the car, the vents pushing out warm air that carried the faint scent of pine from the small freshener I kept hanging by the dashboard. And for a while none of us said anything, just the quiet hum of the engine and the soft ticking of cooling metal from the hospital behind us. The woman held her hands close to the vent, rubbing them slowly as if she was trying to bring feeling back into them, while the man kept glancing at the entrance in the rearview mirror, his eyes searching for something that was not coming. I did not press them right away, because I had learned that truth has a way of surfacing on its own when silence is given enough room. You can wait at my place, I said finally, keeping my voice even, as if I was offering something ordinary. It is only 10 minutes from here, and it is warmer than this parking lot. And again they exchanged that look, the quiet conversation passing between them before he nodded, a little slower this time. The drive was short, just under 8 minutes if the lights cooperated, and they did, as if the road itself had decided to make things easier, but the silence followed us all the way, broken only when the woman spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. He said he would not be long, and I nodded without answering, because I did not trust myself to say what I was thinking. When we reached my house, the porch light was already on, casting a soft glow over the front steps, the kind of light that makes a place feel lived in, safe, and I noticed how both of them paused before stepping out, as if crossing that threshold meant admitting something they were not ready to say out loud. Inside, The warmth wrapped around us immediately. The thermostat set to 72 degrees, the smell of cinnamon still lingering from the candles I had lit earlier that evening, and I guided them to the kitchen table, the same table that had once felt too large for just me, but tonight seemed to fit exactly three. I poured hot cocoa into mugs, the steam rising in slow curls, and placed them gently in front of them, watching as their hands settled around the warmth, holding on to it like it was something more than just a drink. It was not until I set their suitcase by the chair that the envelope slipped free, falling just enough for the edge of the document to show again, crisp, official, unmistakable, and this time I did not look away. "You signed something today," I said quietly, not a question, just an observation, and the man's shoulders stiffened while the woman's grip on the mug tightened. "Just paperwork," he replied, but his voice had lost that practiced ease from earlier, replaced by something thinner, less certain. I reached for the envelope slowly, giving him time to stop me if he wanted to, but he did not, and when I pulled the document free, the words were clear even at a glance. Transfer of ownership, effective immediately, dated that very morning. I set it back down just as carefully as I had picked it up, my movements deliberate, controlled, because I understood now that this was not a misunderstanding, not a simple delay, but something planned, something executed with precision. "Your son is not coming, is he?" I said, and this time it was the woman who answered, her voice breaking just enough to reveal the truth she had been holding back. "He already got what he needed." She did not cry when she said it, and somehow that made it worse, because it was not the sound of someone surprised. It was the quiet acceptance of someone who had been preparing for this moment long before it arrived. The man lowered his gaze to the table, his fingers tracing the rim of the mug without lifting it, and I noticed how carefully he avoided looking at the document, as if refusing to see it might undo what had already been done. I pulled my chair closer, not in a rush, not with urgency, just enough to close the distance between us, because I understood that what they needed first was not advice. It was space to tell the truth without being interrupted. "How long has this been happening?" I asked, keeping my voice low, steady, the kind of tone that does not demand answers but invites them. And this time the man answered, slower than before, choosing each word as if it carried weight. "A few years," he said, and the woman nodded, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her cup. "Little things at first," she added. "He said it would make things easier, managing our accounts, helping with bills. We thought it was normal." And I did not interrupt, because I had heard this pattern before, not in the same details, but in the same shape, the slow shifting of control that feels helpful until it is too late to take it back. Then came the paperwork, she continued, her voice steadier now, as if speaking it aloud gave her something to hold on to. "He said it was just to make sure everything would be taken care of, in case something happened to us." And the man let out a quiet breath, the kind that carries regret without needing to say it. "We trusted him," he said, and that word settled heavily in the room, because trust, once given, does not come with instructions on how to take it back. I glanced at the envelope again, at the clean lines of the document, the signatures placed exactly where they needed to be, and I could see it clearly now, not just what had happened today, but what had been building toward it. "And today," I said gently, "he brought you to the hospital." And the woman nodded, her hands tightening again around the mug. "He said we needed a checkup, routine things, but when we were done, he handed us that paper and said everything was already transferred, that we would be more comfortable somewhere with care." She paused, just long enough for the silence to fill in what she could not say directly. "And then he left," the man finished, his voice barely above a whisper. I leaned back slightly, letting the weight of that settle, because there are moments when speaking too quickly can break something fragile, and this was one of them. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, headlights brushing against the window before disappearing again, and for a brief second, the world felt distant, like everything beyond this room had paused. I looked at them both, at the way they sat side by side, yet seemed smaller than they should have been, as if something essential had been taken along with the house. The accounts, the security they once believed was permanent, and I felt that same quiet certainty return, the one that had followed me since the parking lot. This was not where their story ended, not if I had anything to say about it. "You are not going back there tonight," I said finally, not as a suggestion, but as a decision already made, and neither of them argued, which told me more than any explanation could. I reached for the envelope again, this time with purpose, and as I held it in my hands, I knew this was not just paper, it was a map of everything that had been taken from them, and more importantly, everything that could still be taken back if handled the right way. I did not rush to speak after that, because I knew the next words mattered more than anything I could have said earlier, and I had learned that when people have just lost something they cannot name yet, what they need is not noise, but clarity. I placed the envelope flat on the table and smoothed it gently, as if treating it carefully might somehow restore the respect that had been stripped away from it. And I looked at the signatures again, at the dates, at the notary stamp pressed into the corner, everything neat, everything legal on the surface. Did anyone explain this to you before you signed it? I asked, and Harold shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed downward. He said it was routine, he replied, his voice carrying a quiet disbelief now, as if he was hearing the words again for the first time and realizing how little they meant. Evelyn added softly, there was someone there, an office, papers already prepared. We did not want to make a scene. It was Christmas Eve, and I nodded, because that detail mattered more than they realized. Timing is never accidental in situations like this. I leaned back slightly, folding my hands together, not out of hesitation, but to steady my thoughts, because I could see the pattern clearly now, not just what had been done, but how it had been done, carefully, deliberately, using trust as the entry point and urgency as the pressure. This does not look like something you were meant to fully understand, I said, keeping my tone calm, measured, and that matters. And for the first time, Harold looked up at me directly, something shifting in his expression, not hope yet, but attention, the kind that appears when someone realizes there may still be a path they have not seen. The clock on the wall ticked quietly behind us, each second passing with a steady rhythm that grounded the room, and I stood, moving toward the counter where I kept an old folder tucked away, one I had not opened in years, not since everything changed in my own life. I brought it back to the table and set it down beside the envelope, opening it just enough to reveal a few documents inside. Nothing dramatic, just papers, but papers that represented knowledge, structure, something solid. My husband handled cases like this, I said simply, not elaborating, not turning it into a story about myself, just enough to establish what mattered, and Evelyn's hands tightened slightly around her mug again, but this time it was different, less fragile, more focused. You think this can be undone? She asked, her voice careful, almost afraid to carry too much expectation, and I did not answer immediately, because certainty, when given too quickly, can sound like false reassurance. Instead, I reached for the document again and tapped lightly near the signature line. I think this was done quickly, and I think you were not given the full picture, and those things matter more than people realize, I said, letting each word settle on its own. Outside, the wind brushed lightly against the windows, a soft reminder of the cold they had been standing in not long ago, and I felt that same quiet determination settle deeper within me, the kind that does not announce itself, but stays. Tonight, you rest. I continued, my voice steady, leaving no room for argument. Tomorrow, we start asking the right questions, and this time, when Harold and Evelyn looked at each other, there was something new between them, not certainty, not yet, but the first small shift away from resignation, the kind that only appears when someone finally believes they are not alone in what comes next. The house grew quieter as the night settled in, the kind of stillness that does not feel empty but watchful, as if something important had already begun to shift beneath the surface. I showed them to the guest room at the end of the hallway, a simple space, clean sheets, a small lamp casting a warm light that softened the edges of everything, and I noticed how Evelyn paused at the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame, taking it in not with curiosity, but with careful gratitude, the kind that does not expect to stay. You can take your time, I said gently, stepping back to give them space, and Harold nodded, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of what they had just left behind. I closed the door halfway, not fully, leaving a quiet understanding that they were not alone in this house, then returned to the kitchen where the envelope still rested on the table exactly where I had placed it. Waiting, I sat down again, pulling the document closer under the soft light, and this time I read it properly, line by line, not quickly, not skimming, but carefully, because details matter when something has been constructed to appear clean. The language was precise, almost clinical, ownership transferred, authority reassigned, consent documented, all of it arranged in a way that looked complete, final. But there was something missing beneath the surface, something I had learned to recognize years ago. The absence of clarity, the absence of time, the absence of true understanding. I reached for a pen and a notepad, writing down the date, the names, the office listed at the bottom of the page, each detail becoming a point of reference, something to return to in the morning when questions would need to be asked in the right order. The clock moved past 9, then 10, each hour passing without interruption, and I stayed at the table longer than I intended, not because I needed to, but because I understood that once I stood up, the next part would begin, and I wanted to be certain before I took that step. Eventually, I rose and turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the small lamp by the window on, a habit I had kept for years, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because sometimes it is better to see what is coming before it reaches the door. The night passed without disturbance, no calls, no messages, nothing to suggest that anyone was looking for them, and that silence spoke louder than anything else could have. In the morning, I woke before the sun fully rose, the sky still holding that soft gray before the light breaks through, and I moved quietly through the house, starting the coffee, setting out 3 cups instead of 1. The simple act grounding me in what needed to be done. When Harold and Evelyn stepped into the kitchen, they looked different, not rested exactly, but steadier, as if the warmth and the quiet had given them just enough distance from the night before to stand a little more firmly. I slid the notepad toward them, the names and numbers written clearly, and placed the document beside it. "We are going to start here," I said, my voice calm, leaving no room for hesitation. "And we are going to take this one step at a time." And Harold looked at the paper, then at me, a question forming that he did not fully speak. "And if he calls," he began, but I shook my head slightly, not dismissing the thought, but redirecting it. "If he calls, we will answer when we are ready, not before," I said, and for the first time since the parking lot, there was a quiet shift in the room, something subtle but real, the beginning of control returning to where it had been taken from. The morning light settled slowly across the kitchen table, touching the edges of the documents as if revealing them in a different way than the night before, and I noticed how both Harold and Evelyn looked at the paper now with less confusion and more focus, the kind that comes when fear begins to turn into awareness. I poured coffee into their cups, the steady motion grounding the moment, and then I reached for my phone, scrolling through a list of contacts I had not touched in years, names that belonged to a different chapter of my life, one I had not expected to revisit. But some things do not fade, they simply wait. I stopped at one name and pressed call without hesitation, holding the phone to my ear as the line rang once, then twice, before a familiar voice answered, calm, measured, unchanged. "This is Thomas Reed," and I allowed myself the smallest pause before responding. "Thomas, this is Margaret Collins." And there was a brief silence on the other end, followed by recognition that carried both surprise and respect. "Margaret, it has been a long time," he said, and I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it. "It has, but I need your help," I replied, keeping my words direct, because this was not a conversation meant for catching up. I explained only what was necessary, the document, the timing, the circumstances under which it had been signed, and I could hear the shift in his tone as he listened, the quiet attention of someone who understood the implications without needing them spelled out. "Do not let them sign anything else," he said finally, his voice firm but controlled. "And do not contact the son yet, not until we have reviewed everything." And I glanced at Harold and Evelyn as he spoke, watching how they listened closely, absorbing each word as if it were a step being placed carefully in front of them. "Can you come by today?" I asked, and there was no hesitation in his answer. "I will be there within the hour," he said, and the call ended with a certainty that settled into the room like a foundation being laid. I set the phone down gently and turned back to them. "We are not guessing anymore," I said quietly, and Harold let out a slow breath, the kind that carries tension out with it, while Evelyn straightened slightly in her chair, her posture no longer folded inward but beginning to hold itself again. The minutes that followed moved differently, not slower, but more deliberate, each action tied to purpose. I cleared the table, leaving only the documents and the notepad, aligning them neatly, because order matters when things have been taken out of your control. Outside, the street began to come to life. Distant sounds of cars, a door closing somewhere down the block, ordinary things continuing as if nothing had changed. But inside this house, something had. When the doorbell rang, it was not abrupt, not startling, just a clear signal that the next part had arrived, and I walked to the door without rushing, opening it to find Thomas standing there, his coat pulled tight against the cold, a leather briefcase in one hand, his expression composed but attentive. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, stepping inside, his eyes already scanning the room, taking in the details without asking, and I nodded. "Thank you for coming," I replied, leading him to the table where Harold and Evelyn sat waiting, not as victims anymore, but as people who were about to understand exactly what had been done to them and, more importantly, what could still be undone. Thomas did not sit down immediately. Instead, he placed his briefcase carefully on the table and opened it with a quiet precision that matched everything about him, removing a pair of reading glasses and setting them on before he even touched the document. And I watched Harold and Evelyn as he worked, noticing how their eyes followed every movement, not with anxiety this time, but with a kind of focused anticipation. He read in silence at first, turning each page slowly, his fingers pausing at certain lines, not reacting outwardly, but taking in more than what was written, and the room held that silence without discomfort, because now it had purpose. After a few minutes, he placed the document flat again and looked directly at them, not at me, not at the papers, but at them. "Did anyone explain the long-term implications of this transfer to you?" he asked, his voice calm, exact, and Harold shook his head, more firmly this time. "No," he said, and Evelyn added, "They said it was for convenience," and Thomas nodded once, as if confirming something he already suspected. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a notepad of his own, writing a few short lines before continuing. "This document is structured to appear complete, but there are several elements here that raise concern," he said, tapping lightly near the date and signature lines. "Timing, context, and the absence of independent counsel all matter." And I saw something shift again in Harold's expression, not confusion anymore, but recognition, the understanding that what had happened to him was not simply unfortunate, it was questionable. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her voice quieter but steadier. "So it can be challenged," she said, and Thomas did not rush to answer. Instead, he looked at both of them, measuring his words with care. "It can be reviewed, and if certain conditions were not properly met, it can be contested," he said, and the distinction mattered, not promises, but possibilities grounded in fact. I remained still, letting him guide this part, because this was his space, his language, and they needed to hear it from someone who understood the system from the inside. "What we do next is important," he continued. "We gather everything, every document, every record, any communication that led to this moment." And Harold nodded slowly. "We have bank statements, some letters," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word, and Evelyn added, "and emails from her, not needing to say who, because we all knew." Thomas wrote that down, then looked back at them. "Good, that helps," he said simply, and there was no drama in his tone, just clarity, the kind that replaces fear with direction. I stood then, moving toward the hallway. "There is a guest room dresser," I said. "You can organize everything there. We will go through it together." And as I spoke, I noticed how neither of them hesitated this time. They stood, not quickly, but with intention, as if they were stepping into something rather than being pulled along. As they moved down the hallway, Thomas turned slightly toward me, lowering his voice just enough that it would not carry. "You did the right thing bringing them here," he said, and I nodded once, not out of pride, but because I understood that this was not about what had already been done, it was about what came next. I looked back toward the hallway where Harold and Evelyn had disappeared, the quiet sound of drawers opening and papers being gathered echoing faintly, and I felt that same steady certainty settle deeper, the kind that does not need to be announced, because it shows itself in action. When they returned, carrying folders, envelopes, small pieces of their life that had been organized without question until now. The table filled again, not with confusion, but with evidence, and for the first time since that parking lot, the balance had shifted, not completely, not yet, but enough to know that what had been taken would not remain out of reach for long. The table filled quickly, papers layered over papers, each document carrying a piece of a story that had been quietly rewritten without their consent, and Thomas moved through them with steady focus, sorting, aligning, grouping details that might have seemed ordinary before, but now held weight. I watched as he separated bank statements from correspondence, placing a small stack of printed emails to one side, his finger pausing briefly on certain lines as if marking them in his mind without needing to say it aloud. Harold stood beside him, no longer withdrawn, but present, pointing occasionally to a date, a name, something he remembered but had not understood at the time, and Evelyn sat closer than before, her posture no longer folded inward, her eyes following every movement with a quiet intensity that had replaced the uncertainty from the night before. "This pattern is consistent," Thomas said after a while, not raising his voice, but making sure the words landed clearly. "Gradual consolidation of control, followed by a rapid transfer." And he tapped lightly on the document from the hospital. "This is the final step, not the first." And Harold exhaled slowly, nodding. "It did not feel sudden until now," he admitted, and that was the truth of it. These things rarely begin with a single moment. They build in small, acceptable pieces until the last step feels almost inevitable. I moved closer, placing a hand lightly on the back of a chair, grounding myself in the rhythm of what was unfolding. Because this was no longer about what had been done to them. It was about what could be proven, and more importantly, what could be reversed. Thomas gathered the key documents into a single folder, sliding them neatly into place before closing it with a quiet finality. "We have enough to proceed," he said, and the word proceed carried more weight than any reassurance could have. Evelyn looked at him, her voice steady now. "What happens next?" she asked, and Thomas met her gaze directly. "We initiate a formal review. We request records from the office where this was signed, and we prepare to challenge the validity of the transfer based on lack of informed consent and undue influence," he said, each phrase precise, controlled, leaving no room for misinterpretation. I saw Harold straighten slightly at those words, not because he fully understood the legal terms, but because he understood the direction, the sense that something could be done, that this was not an ending. Outside, the light had shifted again, the morning fully settled into day, casting a brighter clarity through the windows, and I noticed how different everything felt compared to the night before. The same house, the same table, but a completely different atmosphere. One shaped by intention instead of uncertainty. "There is one more thing," Thomas added, his tone measured. "We need to control the timing of any contact with your son," and Harold hesitated briefly before nodding. "He will call," he said, not as a question, but as a fact, and Thomas acknowledged it with a slight tilt of his head. "And when he does, we will be ready," he replied. I stepped back then, giving them space as Thomas outlined the next steps in greater detail, not because I needed to hear every word, but because I understood that this moment belonged to them now, the transition from being acted upon to taking action. As I moved toward the window, I caught my reflection faintly in the glass, the outline of someone who had once stood in a similar kind of silence, unsure of what came next, and I realized that what had begun in a quiet parking lot had already become something more, something structured, something deliberate. Behind me, the conversation continued, steady, focused, and I knew without needing to turn around that the balance had shifted further, not completely yet, but enough that what came next would not be dictated by fear or confusion, but by choice, and that made all the difference. The call came just after noon, right when the room had settled into a quiet rhythm of papers being reviewed and notes being written, and I saw the moment Harold's phone lit up on the table, his hand hovering over it without immediately answering, as if the space between the ring and the decision mattered more than the call itself. He looked at me first, then at Thomas, and Thomas gave a small, steady nod, not permission, but confirmation that this was expected. Harold picked up the phone, his voice calm in a way it had not been the day before. "Hello." Daniel, he said, and even from across the table, I could hear the faint urgency in the voice on the other end, controlled but edged with something sharper beneath it. Dad, where are you? I have been trying to reach you, the voice said, and Harold did not rush to respond. We are safe, he answered simply, and the word safe seemed to shift something in the tone that followed. A brief pause, then a change, subtle but clear. You were supposed to stay at the facility. They were expecting you, Daniel continued, and this time Evelyn leaned slightly closer, not to interrupt, but to listen, her presence no longer hesitant, but grounded. Harold glanced at the papers in front of him before speaking again. We reviewed the documents, he said, his voice steady, and there was a longer silence on the other end now, the kind that reveals more than words. Thomas wrote something quickly on his notepad and slid it closer, just a few words, simple, direct, and Harold read them once before continuing. We will be having everything reviewed formally, he added, and the shift was immediate, the calm tone on the other end tightening, not raised, not aggressive, but no longer comfortable. There is no need for that. Everything was handled properly, Daniel replied, and I watched Harold's expression carefully, expecting hesitation, but it did not come. Instead, there was something new, something measured. We will decide that after a full review, he said, and then he ended the call without waiting for a response, placing the phone back on the table with a quiet finality that seemed to echo louder than any argument could have. The room held still for a moment, not in tension, but in recognition, and Evelyn let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering slightly, as if something heavy had just shifted away from her. Thomas closed his notebook, not abruptly, but with a sense of completion. That was important, he said, his voice calm. You established position without confrontation, and Harold nodded, looking at his hands briefly before lifting his gaze again, steadier than before. I moved toward the window, the afternoon light now bright and clear, casting long lines across the floor, and I realized that what had begun as uncertainty had become something structured, something deliberate, something that would not easily be undone by pressure or persuasion. Behind me, Evelyn spoke quietly, not to anyone in particular, but to the room itself. He thought we would not question it. And there was no bitterness in her voice, just clarity, the kind that comes when confusion has finally been replaced with understanding. I turned back to them, seeing not the same couple I had found in the cold the night before, but two people who had begun to reclaim something that had been taken from them, not just a house or accounts, but their place in their own story. And as the day continued, plans were set, steps were outlined, and for the first time since everything had unfolded, there was no sense of being left behind, only the quiet certainty that what came next would be faced on their own terms, and that was something no document could take away.